Marcus Chen wiped the grease from his hands with an old rag, the familiar smell of engine oil mixing with the crisp mountain air that drifted through the open hangar doors. The former Earth Defense Force sergeant had chosen this isolated spot in the Colorado Rockies for good reason. After 15 years of fighting the Catherian War across 3 star systems, he wanted nothing more than peace, quiet, and the simple satisfaction of fixing broken machinery. The hangar had been a steal at the government auction. Built during the war to house atmospheric fighters, it now served as both his home and workshop. Marcus had converted the back corner into a small living space, complete with a kitchenette and sleeping area. The rest of the massive space housed his collection of salvaged aircraft, ground vehicles, and the occasional piece of alien tech that found its way to Earth's black market. Thunder rumbled overhead, but Marcus barely noticed. Mountain storms were common this time of year, and the hangar's reinforced structure had weathered worse. He was deep under the hood of a civilian transport when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Not thunder, not wind, but something else. Something that made his combat-trained instincts prickle with awareness. The sound came again. A low, pained whine that seemed to echo from the darker recesses of the hangar. Marcus straightened slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward the plasma pistol he still kept clipped to his belt. Old habits died hard, especially when you'd spent most of your adult life in active combat zones. Moving with the silent precision that had kept him alive through countless battles, Marcus grabbed a flashlight and began to investigate. The sound had come from behind the stack of engine parts near the far wall, where shadows gathered thick and impenetrable. As he approached, the whining stopped abruptly, replaced by what sounded like frantic whispering in a language he didn't recognize. Marcus clicked on his flashlight and swept the beam across the cluttered area. At first he saw nothing unusual, just the familiar chaos of spare parts, empty fuel containers, and decommissioned equipment. Then the light caught something that made him freeze in place. 2 pairs of eyes stared back at him from behind a massive starship engine housing. But these weren't human eyes. They glowed with an inner fire, one pair deep amber, the other brilliant green. The eyes were set in faces that were unmistakably reptilian, with scales that seemed to shimmer even in the harsh LED light. Dragons. Marcus had seen plenty of alien species during the war, but dragons were legendary even among the battle-hardened veterans of the Earth Defense Force. The Dracorian Empire had been humanity's most reluctant ally, joining the fight against the Catherians only when their own worlds came under threat. Their representatives at the peace negotiations had been imposing figures, 7 feet tall, covered in gleaming scales, with an air of ancient nobility that made even seasoned diplomats nervous. These dragons were different. Much smaller than the adults Marcus had glimpsed during the war, and clearly young. Their scales were dull and patchy, and they huddled together in a way that spoke of fear and desperation. As his light played over them, he could see how thin they were, ribs clearly visible beneath their scales, their faces gaunt with hunger. The larger of the 2, the one with amber eyes, stepped protectively in front of its companion. When it spoke, its voice was a mixture of pride and desperation, the words heavily accented but clearly in standard galactic. "Stay back, human. We mean no harm, but we will defend ourselves if necessary." Marcus raised his free hand slowly, keeping the flashlight pointed away from their faces. His military training kicked in automatically. Assess the situation, determine the threat level, respond appropriately. These weren't enemy combatants. They were kids, probably teenagers by dragon standards, scared and alone. "Easy there," Marcus said, his voice calm and steady. "I'm not looking for trouble. This is my hangar, and I'm trying to figure out why there are 2 dragons hiding behind my spare parts." The smaller dragon, the one with green eyes, whispered something urgent in what Marcus assumed was the Dracorian language. The amber-eyed dragon's response was sharp and final, clearly shutting down whatever had been suggested. "We will leave," the larger dragon announced. "We did not know this place belonged to someone. We were only seeking shelter from the storm." But as it tried to step forward, the dragon swayed dangerously. Marcus's flashlight caught the way its legs trembled with the effort of staying upright. The smaller dragon immediately moved to support its companion, and Marcus could see that it wasn't in much better condition. Every instinct told Marcus to be cautious. Dragons, even young ones, were incredibly powerful. Their natural abilities included limited fire breathing, enhanced strength, and tough scales that could deflect most small arms fire. But looking at these two pitiful creatures, all he could see were kids in trouble. "When's the last time you ate?" Marcus asked. The question seemed to catch them off guard. The amber-eyed dragon's proud expression faltered for just a moment, and Marcus saw the truth written clearly in both their faces. It had been days, maybe longer. Marcus holstered his pistol and took a step back, giving them space. "Look, I don't know what your story is, and maybe I don't want to know, but you're on my property, and you're clearly in bad shape. I can't just pretend I didn't see you." "We can work," the smaller dragon said suddenly, its voice higher-pitched and more obviously young than its companions. "We are strong. We can lift heavy things, help with repairs. We do not ask for charity." The amber-eyed dragon shot its friend a sharp look, but didn't contradict the statement. Marcus found himself impressed, despite the situation. Even starving and desperate, they were trying to maintain some dignity. "What are your names?" Marcus asked. The dragons exchanged glances. Finally, the larger one spoke. "I am Kael'thar. This is Zixandra. We are—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "We are traveling." Marcus nodded, recognizing evasion when he heard it. "Well, Kael'thar and Zixandra, I'm Marcus, and right now, I'm more concerned about the fact that you both look like you're about to collapse than I am about why you're here." He gestured toward his living area. "I've got food, real food, not just emergency rations, and there's a medical kit if either of you is injured beyond just being underfed." The offer hung in the air between them. Marcus could see the internal struggle playing out on their faces, pride warring with necessity, caution battling desperation. Finally, Zixandra spoke up again. "Why would you help us? Humans and dragons, we are not enemies, but we are not friends either." Marcus considered the question seriously. Why was he offering to help? He'd come to this isolated spot specifically to avoid complications, to live a simple life away from the politics and conflicts that had defined his military career. Taking in two runaway dragons was the opposite of simple. But as he looked at them, really looked at them, he saw something that transcended species. He saw kids who were scared, hungry, and alone. During the war, he'd lost too many young soldiers, human kids barely out of training who died far from home under his command. Maybe this was his chance to actually save someone for once. "Because it's the right thing to do," Marcus said simply, "and because I've got more food than I can eat and a warm place to sleep. Seems stupid to let you starve when I can do something about it." Kael'thar studied Marcus's face for a long moment, those amber eyes seeming to weigh and measure his sincerity. Finally, the young dragon nodded slowly. "We accept your offer of food, but we will work to earn it. We are not beggars." "Fair enough," Marcus said. "But first, let's get some calories in you before you fall over. We can talk about work arrangements after you're not swaying on your feet." As he led the two dragons toward his small kitchen area, Marcus couldn't help but wonder what he was getting himself into. Dragons didn't just end up alone and starving by accident. There had to be a story there, probably a complicated one. But for now, all that mattered was getting them fed and safe. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the hangar, something unexpected was beginning. A former soldier who'd thought his fighting days were over was about to discover that sometimes the most important battles weren't fought on distant worlds against alien invaders. Sometimes they were fought right at home, one act of kindness at a time. As Marcus began pulling ingredients from his small refrigerator, he caught Zixandra watching him with those brilliant green eyes. There was intelligence there and curiosity, but also a wariness that spoke of hard experiences for someone so young. "How old are you two anyway?" Marcus asked as he started heating a pot of stew he'd made earlier in the week. "By human standards? I am perhaps 17 of your years," Kael'thar said stiffly. "Zixandra is 15. Marcus nodded, his suspicions confirmed. They were basically teenagers, which explained both their naivety in seeking shelter in a random hangar and their stubborn insistence on maintaining their dignity despite obvious desperation. "Long way from home?" Marcus asked casually, stirring the stew. The silence that greeted this question was answer enough. Marcus didn't push. Whatever had driven them to Earth, to this remote corner of the planet, it wasn't something they were ready to talk about. That was fine. He'd been a soldier long enough to know when to press for information and when to let things develop naturally. The smell of warming food began to fill the small space, and Marcus noticed both dragons' nostrils flaring as they caught the scent. Their stomachs growled audibly, and despite their obvious efforts to maintain composure, they couldn't hide their hunger. "This will take a few minutes to heat properly," Marcus said. "Why don't you sit down? There are some chairs over by the workbench." As the two dragons settled themselves, Marcus continued his preparations. The stew was a simple but hearty mixture of beef, vegetables, and potatoes. Nothing fancy, but filling and nutritious. He'd learned to cook during his military service, where being able to turn basic rations into something palatable was a valuable skill. While the food warmed, Marcus found himself stealing glances at his unexpected guests. Now that they were in better light, he could see more details. Their scales, while dull from malnutrition, showed hints of their true colors. Kael'thar's were a deep bronze that would probably shine like metal when healthy, while Zixandra's were a rich emerald green. Both showed signs of recent travel, scratches on their scales, worn patches on their clothing, the general weariness that came from days or weeks on the road. "Where did you come from tonight?" Marcus asked. "I mean, did you walk here or—" Kael'thar hesitated before answering. "We have been traveling for many days. On foot mostly. We saw your lights from the mountain trail and hoped to find shelter from the storm." Marcus nodded. The trail Kael'thar mentioned was an old hiking path that wound through the mountains. It wasn't commonly used, especially this time of year, which explained why Marcus hadn't seen any other travelers. It also suggested that the dragons were deliberately avoiding more populated areas. The stew reached serving temperature, and Marcus ladled generous portions into 3 bowls. He handed the first 2 to his guests and was struck by how carefully they accepted them, as if the bowls were precious objects that might be snatched away at any moment. "Go ahead," Marcus encouraged, settling down with his own bowl. "It's nothing fancy, but it's hot and filling." The dragons needed no further encouragement. They ate with the focused intensity of people who hadn't seen a proper meal in far too long, yet still managed to maintain a certain dignity in their manner. Marcus found himself impressed by their self-control. Hungry as they were, they didn't wolf down the food, but ate steadily and purposefully. As the immediate edge of their hunger was satisfied, the atmosphere in the small space began to relax slightly. Color started to return to their faces, and some of the tension left their shoulders. "This is very good," Zixandra said quietly. "Thank you." "You're welcome," Marcus replied. "There's more if you want it." Both dragons looked up at him with expressions of surprised gratitude, as if the offer of seconds was unexpected generosity. It made Marcus wonder even more about their background. Dragons were supposed to be a proud, wealthy species. The Dracorian Empire controlled significant mining operations across multiple star systems. For young dragons to be in this kind of desperate situation suggested something had gone very wrong in their lives. As they ate, Marcus's practical mind began to work through the implications of their presence. Two young dragons, clearly runaways from something, showing up at his isolated hangar during a storm. It wasn't coincidence. They'd been looking for shelter, probably for some time, which meant they were likely to be missed, and people might come looking for them. That thought brought with it a host of complications Marcus wasn't sure he was ready to deal with. But looking at Kael'thar and Zixandra as they gratefully accepted second helpings of stew, he found he couldn't bring himself to care about the potential problems. These kids needed help, and he was in a position to provide it. The question was, what happened next? 3 days had passed since Marcus discovered the two young dragons in his hangar, and the routine they'd fallen into felt surprisingly natural. Despite their initial insistence that they would work for their food, Marcus had first focused on getting them properly fed and rested. Both Kael'thar and Zixandra had been more exhausted than they'd initially let on, and the first day had been spent mostly sleeping and eating small, frequent meals as their systems adjusted to regular nutrition again. By the second day, however, they were insisting on making good on their promise to help with the work. Marcus had been skeptical at first. His hangar was filled with heavy machinery and delicate electronics. Not exactly the safest environment for inexperienced helpers. But the dragons had surprised him with their competence and dedication. Kael'thar turned out to have an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems that impressed even Marcus's experienced eye. The young dragon could look at a complex piece of machinery and immediately understand how it was supposed to function, often spotting problems that Marcus had missed. His natural strength made moving heavy components effortless, but he was also surprisingly gentle when working with delicate parts. Zixandra had different talents. Her smaller size allowed her to access tight spaces that Marcus couldn't reach, and she had an almost supernatural ability to organize and catalog parts. Within a day, she had completely reorganized his spare parts inventory using a system that was both logical and efficient. She also showed remarkable skill with electronics, her delicate touch perfect for working with sensitive circuits. Marcus was beginning to realize that having them around wasn't just charity. They were genuinely useful helpers. It made him feel better about the arrangement, knowing that they were contributing rather than simply accepting his help. On the morning of the 4th day, Marcus was working on the engine of a civilian transport when he noticed Kael'thar watching him with unusual intensity. The young dragon had been quieter than usual since waking up, and there was something in his expression that suggested he was working up to saying something important. "Something on your mind?" Marcus asked, not looking up from his work. Kael'thar was silent for a long moment before answering. "You have been kind to us. More than kind. But you deserve to know why we are here, what we are running from." Marcus set down his tools and turned to face the dragon fully. Zixandra, who had been sorting through a box of electronic components nearby, also stopped working and moved closer. Her expression was nervous, but she nodded to Kael'thar encouragingly. "You don't owe me any explanations," Marcus said carefully. "I told you that the first night." "No, but we owe ourselves honesty," Kael'thar replied. "And if we are to stay here longer, if we are to continue working with you, then you should know what risks you might be taking." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Risks. That confirmed his suspicions that their situation was more complicated than simple runaways seeking adventure. Kael'thar took a deep breath before beginning. "We are not just travelers, Marcus. We are fugitives. We fled from the Dracorian colony ship Eternal Flame, which is currently in orbit around your moon." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. A Dracorian colony ship. Those were massive vessels, city-sized structures that housed tens of thousands of dragons. The Eternal Flame had arrived at Earth 6 months ago as part of the post-war immigration agreement, carrying dragons who wanted to establish new lives away from their war-torn homeworlds. "The colony ship?" Marcus said slowly. "That's a big place to run away from. What happened?" Zixandra spoke up, her voice quiet but determined. "Our families arranged marriages for us. To dragons we had never met, from powerful families we had never heard of. The arrangements were made to strengthen political alliances and secure mining rights in the outer systems." "Arranged marriages," Marcus repeated. "I thought dragons didn't do that anymore." "The old families still do," Kael'thar said bitterly, "especially when there is profit involved. The Eternal Flame carries many of the most traditional dragon houses, those who see the relocation to human space as an opportunity to restore the old ways without interference from the more progressive elements of our society." Marcus was beginning to understand. The young dragons weren't just running from unwanted marriages. They were fleeing from an entire social system that saw them as commodities to be traded for political advantage. "We were told that we would be married within days of arrival at Earth," Zixandra continued, "that our futures had been decided and our opinions on the matter were irrelevant. When we protested, we were told that this was the price of family honor and that our individual desires were selfish and unimportant." "So you ran," Marcus said. "We ran," Kael'thar confirmed. 3 weeks ago, during a supply run to Earth's surface. We were supposed to accompany a shopping expedition to Denver. Instead, we slipped away and began walking into the mountains. Marcus whistled softly. 3 weeks. You've been on the run for 3 weeks. "We had some money," Zixandra said. "Enough for food for the first week. After that?" She gestured helplessly. "We knew nothing about surviving on Earth. We are city dwellers, used to the controlled environment of the ship. We were not prepared for your weather, your geography, your wildlife." That explained their condition when he'd found them. 3 weeks of sleeping rough in the Colorado mountains, running out of money and food, probably getting lost multiple times. It was a miracle they'd survived at all. "They must be looking for you," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Kael'thar said grimly. "Dragon families do not simply accept the loss of their children, especially when there are political arrangements at stake. They will have contacted human authorities by now, filed missing person reports. There are probably search teams combing the mountains." Marcus felt the familiar weight of decision settling on his shoulders. It was a feeling he remembered from the war, moments when he had to choose between safety and what was right, between following orders and following his conscience. "What do you want to do?" he asked. The question seemed to surprise them. Zixandra blinked her green eyes in confusion. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what's your plan? Do you want to go back? Do you want to keep running? Do you want to try to make a new life somewhere else?" Kael'thar and Zixandra exchanged glances. It was clear they hadn't thought beyond immediate survival. "We cannot go back," Kael'thar said finally. "Even if we wanted to, which we do not, our families would never trust us again. We would be watched constantly, married off even more quickly to prevent another escape attempt. And we cannot run forever," Zixandra added. "We have no money, no identification documents, no legal status on Earth. Eventually, we would be caught and returned to the ship anyway." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "So you need a third option." "What third option?" Kael'thar asked. Marcus was quiet for a moment, thinking through the possibilities. During his military service, he'd dealt with political refugees from various alien species. There were protocols for these situations, legal frameworks that could provide protection for those fleeing persecution, even from their own families. "Political asylum," Marcus said finally. Earth has treaties with the Dracorian Empire that include provisions for individuals seeking protection from forced marriage and other traditional practices that violate galactic human rights standards. Both dragons stared at him. Political asylum? Zixandra whispered. It's not simple, Marcus warned. There would be paperwork, interviews, legal proceedings. It could take months, and there's no guarantee it would be approved. But if it were approved, Kael'thar asked, then you'd be legal residents of Earth, free to make your own choices about your futures. Your families couldn't force you to return to the ship. The hope that appeared in their eyes was almost painful to see. Marcus realized that they'd probably never considered the possibility that their situation might have a legal solution. How would we even begin such a process? Zixandra asked. Well, Marcus said, that's where things get complicated. To apply for asylum, you need to be in contact with Earth authorities, which means admitting where you are and potentially being detained while your case is processed. The hope in their expressions dimmed. Detained, Kael'thar repeated. It's not the same as being sent back to your families, Marcus said quickly. Asylum seekers are held in special facilities while their cases are reviewed. They're not luxurious, but they're not prisons either. And most importantly, you can't be forced to return to the situation you're fleeing from until your case is decided. And if our case is denied? Zixandra asked quietly. Marcus hesitated before answering honestly. Then you'd probably be returned to your families and the colony ship. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of impossible choices. Marcus watched as the two young dragons struggled with the decision. Stay hidden and live as fugitives with no legal rights, or trust in a system that might protect them but offered no guarantees. There is another option, Marcus said suddenly, an idea forming as he spoke. A way to improve your chances of asylum approval and buy some time to prepare your case. Both dragons looked at him expectantly. I could apply to sponsor you as temporary workers, Marcus continued, working through the idea as he spoke. The post-war reconstruction treaties include provisions for skilled alien workers to be sponsored by human businesses. It's usually used for large corporations, but there's nothing preventing individuals from participating. What would that mean? Kael'thar asked. It would give you legal status on Earth for up to 6 months while you worked for me. During that time, you could prepare your asylum case with proper legal representation. And if your asylum is denied, you'd have the work visa as a backup, which could potentially be extended or converted to permanent residency if you can demonstrate valuable skills. Marcus could see them processing this information, hope warring with caution in their expressions. You would do this for us? Zixandra asked, even knowing the risks? What risks? Marcus asked, though he knew the answer. Getting involved in a political asylum case would draw attention from both human and dragon authorities. His quiet, isolated life would become anything but quiet. Your government will scrutinize you, Kael'thar said. Our families will see you as an enemy who helped us escape our obligations. There could be diplomatic complications. Marcus thought about that for a moment. It was true. Helping them could bring him a world of trouble. But then he looked at these two young people who'd been brave enough to flee everything they'd ever known, rather than accept a future chosen for them by others, and he realized the decision had already been made. Then we'd better make sure we do this right, Marcus said, because I'm not letting them drag you back to something you don't want. The relief and gratitude that flooded their faces was worth every potential complication that might come his way. For the first time since finding them, Marcus saw them truly smile, not the careful, guarded expressions they'd worn while trying to maintain their dignity, but genuine, youthful joy. There's just one thing, Marcus added, and their smiles dimmed slightly. If we're going to do this legally, we need to contact the authorities soon. Every day you stay here without proper documentation makes the situation more complicated. Kael'thar nodded seriously. When? Tomorrow, Marcus said. I'll make some calls tonight, find out exactly what paperwork we need and who we need to contact. Then we'll drive into town and get this process started. And until then? Zixandra asked. Until then, we work, Marcus said, gesturing toward the partially assembled engine. Because in 24 hours, you're going to be my official employees, and I want to make sure you know what you're doing. As they returned to their tasks, Marcus felt a familiar sensation, the mixture of anticipation and anxiety that came before any major operation. He'd felt it before every important mission during the war, and he was feeling it now. The difference was that this time he wasn't fighting for territory or strategic advantage. This time he was fighting for something much simpler and much more important: the right of two young people to choose their own futures. Tomorrow would bring lawyers, paperwork, and probably a lot of complicated questions. But today, there was work to be done and a plan to execute. And for the first time in years, Marcus felt like he was fighting for something that truly mattered. The storm that had brought the dragons to his hangar had passed, but Marcus had the feeling that an even bigger storm was just beginning. This time, however, he wasn't facing it alone. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the doorway of his hangar and marveled at how much his life had changed. What had once been a simple repair facility run by a solitary ex-soldier had transformed into something that even he hadn't imagined possible. The legal proceedings had been complex, but ultimately successful. Kael'thar and Zixandra had been granted temporary asylum status while their case was reviewed, and the work visa sponsorship had provided the legal framework for them to stay and contribute. More importantly, the Human Rights Tribunal had ruled that forced arranged marriages constituted persecution under galactic law, setting a precedent that would help other young dragons in similar situations. But the real transformation went far beyond paperwork and legal victories. The hangar now buzzed with activity that would have been impossible before. Kael'thar's mechanical intuition had proven even more valuable than Marcus had initially realized. The young dragon could diagnose problems with machinery that had stumped human technicians, and his natural strength allowed for repairs that would have required heavy lifting equipment. Word had spread through the underground network of independent mechanics and salvage operators, and they now had a steady stream of customers bringing difficult jobs that only Kael'thar could handle. Zixandra had surprised everyone, including herself, by developing into a skilled electronics specialist. Her delicate touch and natural understanding of complex systems made her invaluable for working on the sophisticated alien technology that had become common on Earth after the war. She'd even started taking correspondence courses in advanced electronics, working toward official certification in her new field. But perhaps the most significant change was how their presence had attracted others. The first had been Thorek, a young Kytherian whose family had been wiped out during the final battles of the war. He'd heard about the human who helped dragons through the alien community's informal network and had shown up at the hangar 3 months earlier, desperate for work and a place to belong. Despite their species' recent history as enemies, Thorek and the dragons had quickly bonded over their shared experience of being displaced young people trying to build new lives. Then came Senna, a human teenager whose parents had been killed in the Kytherian attacks on Luna Base. She'd aged out of the foster care system with nowhere to go, and impressive skills with spacecraft engines. Marcus had found her sleeping in a derelict shuttle at the nearby spaceport and offered her the same deal he'd given the dragons: work for room, board, and training. Now the hangar housed 5 people from 4 different species, and somehow it worked. They'd become a family of sorts, bound together not by blood or shared origins, but by common purpose and mutual support. Marcus smiled as he watched the morning routine unfold. Kael'thar and Thorek were working together on a particularly challenging fusion drive repair, their different perspectives and abilities complementing each other perfectly. Despite their species' history, They'd developed a friendship based on shared expertise and mutual respect. Zixandra was training Senna on the intricacies of dragon-built electronics, the two young women chattering and laughing as they worked. The trust and ease between them was a testament to how quickly artificial boundaries could be overcome when people were simply allowed to be themselves. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. The attention from their successful asylum case had brought both positive and negative consequences. They'd received job offers from major corporations impressed by their unique skills, but they'd also faced harassment from anti-alien groups who saw their success as a threat to human supremacy. There had been tense moments with the dragon families from the Eternal Flame who had initially tried legal action to force Kylthar and Zixandra's return, but the precedent set by the asylum case had ultimately convinced them to accept defeat. And both young dragons had even received grudging messages from their families acknowledging their independence. The real validation, however, had come from an unexpected source. 2 weeks earlier, they'd received a visit from Admiral Sarah Chen, Marcus's former commanding officer and current head of the Earth Defense Force's Alien Integration Division. "Chen," Marcus had said when she'd arrived in an official transport, using her military title out of old habit. "What brings you to my little corner of nowhere?" Admiral Chen had smiled, but her expression was serious. "You do, Sergeant. Or rather, what you've accomplished here." She'd spent the morning touring the facility, talking with each of the residents, and observing their work. When she'd finally sat down with Marcus over coffee, her expression had been thoughtful. "Do you know what you've created here, Marcus?" she'd asked. "A business," Marcus had replied. "A place for some displaced kids to get on their feet." "You've created a model," Admiral Chen had corrected. "A proof of concept for something we've been struggling with since the war ended, multi-species integration at the ground level." She'd explained that the government had been trying to figure out how to successfully integrate the millions of alien refugees and immigrants who had come to Earth after the war. Most official programs focused on large-scale resettlement in designated communities, but those efforts often led to isolation and resentment. "What you've done here is different," she'd continued. "You've shown that integration works best when it happens naturally, when people are brought together by common purpose rather than bureaucratic mandate." That conversation had led to an offer that Marcus was still considering. The Earth Defense Force wanted to use his hangar as a pilot program for a new kind of integration center, a place where displaced aliens and humans could work together, learn from each other, and build the skills needed for productive citizenship. They were offering significant funding, official recognition, and the resources to expand the operation to help many more people. The offer was tempting, but Marcus was cautious. He'd built something special here, and he didn't want to lose the personal, family-like atmosphere that made it work by turning it into just another government program. "What do you think?" he asked, as the group gathered for their evening meal. A tradition they'd maintained since the early days. The question was directed at all of them, but he looked particularly at Kylthar and Zixandra, whose opinions mattered most to him. "It would mean helping more people like us," Zixandra said thoughtfully. "That is appealing. But it would also mean more structure, more oversight, more rules," Kylthar added. "We have freedom here to work as we choose, to build something together. Would that survive becoming an official program?" Thorek, who had been quiet throughout the discussion, suddenly spoke up. "My people have a saying, 'The river that tries to help every fish often drowns them all.' Perhaps wisdom lies in perfecting what we have before attempting to expand it." Senna nodded agreement. "I like it here because it feels real. Everyone contributes. Everyone matters. If it gets too big, too official, we might lose that." Marcus listened to their perspectives and felt a familiar warmth. These young people had taught him something important about leadership. Sometimes the best way to command was to trust others to make their own decisions and support them when they did. "Then we stay small for now," he decided. We keep building what we have, keep learning from each other. Maybe in a few years, when we're sure we understand what makes this work, we can think about expansion. Admiral Chen had accepted his decision with good grace when he'd called to decline the offer. You're probably right, she'd admitted. Some things can't be rushed or forced. But Marcus, when you're ready, when you think the time is right, the offer will still be there. Now, 6 months after 2 starving dragons had stumbled into his hangar seeking shelter from a storm, Marcus looked around at the bustling workspace and the family he'd never expected to have. Kael'thar had grown into a confident young adult, his natural leadership abilities emerging as he took on more responsibility for the mechanical side of their operations. Zixandra had blossomed into a skilled technician and was even considering applying to engineering school to formalize her education. Thorek had found peace working with his hands after the trauma of war, and his quiet wisdom had become an anchor for the group during difficult times. Senna had discovered a talent for organization and logistics that kept their increasingly complex operation running smoothly. But perhaps the most significant change was in Marcus himself. For years after the war, he'd carried the weight of all the young soldiers he hadn't been able to save, all the missions that had gone wrong despite his best efforts. Helping these 4 young people find their place in the world had begun to heal wounds he'd thought would never close. As evening settled over the mountains and the group prepared to close the hangar for the day, Marcus reflected on how a simple act of kindness had fundamentally altered the course of his life. He'd offered food and shelter to 2 desperate young dragons, thinking it would be a brief interruption in his quiet existence. Instead, he'd discovered that sometimes the most important victories weren't won on distant battlefields against alien enemies. They were won right at home, one life at a time. The dragons who had stumbled into his hangar during that storm had indeed changed his fate forever. But what he'd come to understand was that fate wasn't something that just happened to you. It was something you created through the choices you made and the people you chose to help along the way. Outside, the Colorado mountains stood silent and eternal under a canopy of stars that included worlds where humans, dragons, Cytherians, and dozens of other species were learning to build new lives together. Inside the hangar, 5 people from different worlds worked side by side, proving every day that the future belonged to those brave enough to reach across the spaces that divided them. Marcus smiled as he watched Kael'thar carefully banking the forge fire while Zixandra ran final diagnostics on the day's repair work. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help others find their way. But tonight, they had accomplished something important. They had built a home where anyone could belong, regardless of where they came from or what they had been through. In the end, that might be the most human thing of all. The simple recognition that family wasn't about blood or species or where you were born. It was about who you chose to stand with when the storms came, and who chose to stand with you in return. The hangar fell quiet as the day's work ended, but it was the satisfied quiet of a job well done and a future full of possibilities. And somewhere in orbit around the moon, other young dragons looked down at Earth and wondered if they too might find the courage to choose their own path among the stars.